From the Toronto Star, I'm Rudgy Mudler, and this matters. I say this with apologies to Canadian icon Tom Cochrane, but in Ontario, life is a political highway. Here's what Premier Doug Ford said on Monday in Bradford when announcing the province will be paying for the Bradford Bypass, a new highway which will link the 400 and 404 highways.
Communities in this area have been asking governments for years and decades for a solution to the worsening traffic congestion, but their voices fell on deaf ears of previous governments who turned their backs on commuters. Past governments, our opponents, they side with ideological activists who oppose any and all highways over hard-working families.
Longtime political watchers may remember late former Toronto Mayor Rob Ford declared an end to the war on the car. And now, his brother, the Premier, looks to be readying his party as the valiant defender in the war on highways. With mentions of the Bradford Bypass and the proposed Highway 413 all over this government's recent economic update, the Tories are betting that the road to re-election is paved with new highways. Is this a freeway to re-election, or a toll the electorate decides they don't want to pay? Robert Benzie is the Queen's Park Bureau Chief for The Star. He joins to discuss the politics of highways. Rob, thanks so much for being back on the show.
Always a pleasure with you.
So Rob, we're going to be talking a lot about two new roads that potentially could be coming to the province. The proposed Highway 413, which would be a 60-kilometer road connecting Milton to Vaughan, and the proposed Bradford Bypass, which would be a new 16-kilometer highway connecting Highway 400 to Highway 404. The Premier was up in Bradford on Monday. Can you tell us a little bit about the event and what was announced there?
Well, there are two different projects, major highway projects, Raju, that the Tories see as key to their electoral prospects in 2022. There's an election on June 2nd, next June 2nd, and they want to be talking about highways because they know that in the Greater Toronto area, there are a lot of voters who are commuters and want to see more infrastructure. So these two projects were touted last week in Peter Bethlenfalvy's mini budget. But I caution because I think the two projects, one is pie in the sky and one is almost certainly going to happen. The 413 is probably never going to be built. The route almost mirrors the 407 that's already existing. It goes 60 kilometers and all of the local municipalities oppose it. But the Ford government sees it as politically advantageous to talk about it. It's many, many years away. If it ever got built, it would cost $10 billion perhaps, and could be 10 or 20 years from completion. So it's not something that is really as pertinent as the Bradford Bypass, which is something that's been in the hopper for about a quarter century. It's popular locally. The opposition Liberals of Stephen Del Duca don't oppose it. And Del Duca was the transportation minister under Premier Kathleen Wynne. And he says that this project has its merits because it's popular locally. So Premier Ford was in Bradford on Monday to talk about this new 16.2 kilometer bypass that would connect Highway 400 with the 404. North of 401, the DVP becomes the 404. So this is a road that has been talked about for a long time, because a lot of these little towns and communities are along the route near the Holland Marsh and all these places that have tons of traffic from people trying to get from the 400 to the 404. So they think this will help farmers because it'll get people off of rural roads. The problem is, of course, it's going to also pave over a lot of farmland. And there's a lot of controversy about that. And the Premier was saying how this is going to help reduce gridlock and therefore reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But Mike Schreiner, the Green Party leader, made a very good point when he said, look, there's a thing called induced demand, so that when you build highways, you actually don't decrease congestion, you increase it because the highways just fill up. We've seen this throughout North America, throughout the world. So even still, the Ford government is forging ahead with this one. And it is, as I said, popular locally. The mayor of Bradford West Gwillimbury was saying this is something that has been around for as long as anyone can remember in that region because, the farmers are sick of competing with commuters as they drive their tractors along rural roads. So that's one to watch for sure.
Okay, they see this as politically advantageous. You described it as sort of a campaign-style stop in the story. You touched on some of the things about the public sentiment, but this is just it. Why is it that the Ford government sees this as a wedge issue?
Well, I don't know if they see it as it's a wedge against the New Democrats because the New Democrats are opposed to it. But I think as we emerge from the pandemic, the pandemic is not over yet, Raju, unfortunately, but it is, I think, in the public's mind, it seems to be waning. And I think the government wants to be talking about what Ontario will look like after the pandemic and getting people back to work. Now, Ontario actually has a worker shortage, labor shortage. We already have too many jobs in the province, 300,000 too many actually, which is a good problem to have, I suppose. But the government wants to create more employment. So they think the Bradford Bypass will, create something like 7,500 jobs, annual jobs during construction after it started next year and completed in 2024. So they see that as a good thing. And it's also, they want to be seen as building hospitals, building long-term care homes, building schools, building highways, building bridges and roads, and seeing that as a positive thing and saying, look, see, we're getting out of the pandemic. It's like the post-war boom that we had in the 1940s, late 1940s and 50s in Canada. And I think that's what they're hoping for. Now, it remains to be seen because remember, we still don't have a price tag on any of these things. The Star had forensic accountant Charles Smedmore look into this. Charles estimates that it'll cost more than $2 billion to build the Bradford Bypass alone. And the Premier said on Monday that taxpayers will pay for it. It's not going to be a toll road, which, the user pay model is more popular in the world now. So a lot of us were surprised that you wouldn't have this be a user pay road, but they don't want it to be like the 407.
There's two things about the sort of budget and planning stuff that I want to touch on. The Ford government has also announced a large-scale infrastructure plan that these are sort of a part of, right? I want you to talk to us a little bit about that. And then the other thing is that you mentioned already, this is all over the mini budget, but it wasn't in the March 24 budget. Neither of these things were, right?
No.
So I'm sorry, there's a little bit of a disconnect there. So anyways, let's talk first about that infrastructure plan and then a little bit about how these highways have sort of been sprung up.
Well, I mean, in the infrastructure plan that the Premier has talked about for many, many months now, and the amounts change. I think the amount he's using now is $144 billion over more than a decade. And that includes a ton of stuff, much of which, you and I've talked about before, like the Ontario line, which is the 13-kilometer subway that would go from Ontario Place on the lakefront all the way up to the Ontario Science Centre in Don Mills. That's a big project. And the Scarborough subway extension, which has been talked about ad nauseum forever and ever, that's the 3-stop, which basically just mirrors the existing LRT. It's a project that the wisdom of that one has always eluded me. That's my personal view, but I don't live on that line. So I understand why people there would want it, I suppose. And they're also going to extend the Eglinton Crosstown, which hasn't even been completed yet. I mean, it's supposed to open next year. And they would like it to already extend out to almost to the airport practically. So again, it's part of this build, and creates jobs and creates needed infrastructure. And I don't think that they're wrong on that front. I mean, I think building transit does get people out of their cars. So it's kind of counterintuitive that on the same time as they're talking about building more transit, they're also building more highways that'll lead to more traffic, lead to more urban sprawl. Instead of saying like, oh, yeah, we're going to build the Bradford Bypass, we're also going to build an LRT that goes from the 404 to the 400. I mean, I guess they're trying to appeal to different people in different parts of the province at the same time. It's a popular sentiment, though, to invest in infrastructure. All levels of government are doing that. Money is cheap to borrow right now, but interest rates are going to go up as inflation goes up. So will it be as popular when inflation rates are at 6-7% instead of being at under 2%? I don't know.
We'll be right back. You mentioned them already, but I also just want to be very clear about some of the barriers to these things. There are environmental concerns, and then the other thing, no idea how much the highway is going to cost, right? Those are two big things, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's political concerns too. The Star and National Observer did a joint investigation into the Bradford Bypass and found that a golf course that is owned by Stan Cho, who's the Associate Minister of Transportation, his father owns a golf course, and the route is going around that golf course. Now, Mr. Cho, he's declared a conflict of interest. He is not in the loop on what's happening in this project. But he was only appointed to that ministry a few months ago, and I don't know what they were thinking. The government didn't put him in a great position because his father's owned this golf course for years and years and years. So they must have known that. It's really ham-fisted on their part to put him in a difficult position like that. Now, Caroline Mulroney, the transportation minister, she's shepherding this file. It goes through her riding. She was talking about it on Monday and how this is such an important project. We asked her about the environmental assessments because the last EAs on this are basically from the 1990s. So she said that those are going to be updated, but I don't think they're going to be not building this highway because of, a rare toad or a dragonfly or something, or sunflowers. I mean, they seem to be full speed ahead, even though environmentalists have really, really deep concerns and understandable concerns. They want to start building next year. They want to start having requests for proposal in March. And that's significant, Raju, because the election is in June. And they want to be able to say, look, we've got a sign in the ground saying coming soon, the Bradford Bypass. And all politicians do this, all political parties do this, and they're going to be electioneering on this for sure.
About that, this is one of these things that I want to talk about the public sentiment here. This government has gotten in some issues in lots of smaller communities, particularly in the 905 and a little bit northern Ontario, by trying to jam in a bunch of ministerial zoning orders. They say these things need to happen to get development going. Okay, Bradford Bypass. Let's say it's probably going to happen. Those communities want it. The 413, it just seems really strange to me because the communities don't want it. So what's the thinking there?
Yeah, the local communities along the 413 route have voted against it at council, which is astounding when you think about it, because municipal government is probably the easiest level of government for developers to manipulate. I'm not casting aspersions on municipal governments, but I mean, history has shown that developers tend to get their own way when it comes to municipal government. And whether it's in Toronto or in the 905, that seems to be the case, unfortunately. In this case, the developers have not ruled the day. And in part, it's because there are rival factions. Some developers don't want the 413 built because it's not in their interest. The people who own the land, and again, the Star's done a big investigation on that too. Our colleagues in the investigative team did a really good piece on that a few months back on showing who owns the land. And some of the people who own that land are developers with connections to the progressive conservatives. And that's problematic. And I think even within Ford's office, there are some people who have concerns about that and wondering about the optics, and also about the fact that the 413 is so many years away. Do they want to pay a political price now for something that may not get built until, our grandkids are basically driving their electric cars or solar powered cars or whatever they have by then? But the 413, even though, as I said earlier, it's pie in the sky, the Bradford Bypass is not. And so the government likes to have these two projects. They both serve the 905. Even though one's probably never going to happen, the other one almost certainly will happen. And I think that they like to show that they're building and that they're doing something for gridlock, they say, in the 905.
This is what I don't get about this. The Conservatives need the 905 to win. These are the safer ridings for them. The party has been using these MZOs in many communities, making some people upset. And now, in the case of Highway 413, they plan to campaign on something that the municipalities up there don't want. Again, how does the thinking on this work?
The previous Liberal government canceled the 413 because they thought it was unnecessary. It would only save about 30 seconds or 60 seconds of commuting time, even though on a 60-kilometer route, which is extraordinary. But the Tories say that no, it in fact saved between 30 minutes and 60 minutes. I don't know. I mean, the truth is probably in the middle. But the thing has no price tag. The land has not been expropriated. It is so far from even the beginning of the beginning that I think they can talk about it in theoretical terms, and therefore say to voters in those communities where local municipalities have voted against it, say, look, we won't build it if it's not worth it, but we should have a look at it. I think that's what they're going to be saying. I personally don't believe the 413 will be built, but I think the Bradford Bypass, tying it to that is not a bad idea if you're the Tories, because the Bradford Bypass is probably going to happen. So you can say, look, you see, we're pushing ahead. And if something turns out to not be needed or not be wanted, we won't build it. But that doesn't mean we're not going to build it anywhere else.
Conservative messaging so far in the election campaigns is this government who says yes.
Yeah. It's an odd one. Yeah, he's a yes man. He wants to be seen as a yes man. And I think that's because their own internal research has shown that Ford himself is a polarizing figure. And some people may have negative views of him and think that he is some kind of a cost-cutting ogre or something, which there's no evidence to show that he's a cost cutter. I don't actually think that Premier is a fiscal conservative. And I talk to Tories who say he's not even a conservative. He's a populist, and he's spending 20 cents on every dollar more than Premier Kathleen Wynne's Liberals did at their biggest spending time. So he is definitely not a cost cutter. And is he penny wise, pound foolish? I don't know. I can't speak to that. But I mean, even for him saying, I'm going to spend every penny that we get from the federal government, instead of saying, maybe we need to save for a rainy day, or maybe we need to do this or that. He's all about big spending. So if you like big government, then you're getting big government at Queen's Park right now.
We just really be clear about this. The highways, the infrastructure, this is really a thing to change the conversation from the pandemic, which, to be fair, Doug Ford did a pretty good job at the beginning of it. And then, of course, there's been lots of criticism. But is it fair to say that that's sort of what's happening here?
Yeah, I think the pandemic is 20 months old. Ontario's had its ups and its downs, but the sky did not fall here. It just didn't. Ontario did better in this pandemic than Quebec, Michigan, New York, or Manitoba. Those are all of its neighbors, per capita and in real terms. And does Ford get a lot of the blame for the screw-ups? Yes. Does he deserve it? Yes. But if you're going to blame him for the things that went wrong, he probably deserves some credit for the things that went right. We're at 88% with one shot, 85% fully vaccinated of 12 and up, which makes the province one of the leading jurisdictions in North America. We've had fewer deaths than Quebec. Quebec's had, I think, 14 or 15% more deaths than we've had, and they have only 57, 58% of our population. So, I mean, if you're going to compare apples and oranges, I mean, New York State is a basket case. Michigan is a basket case compared to Ontario. So I think that if you're Ford, you want to say, look, it's time to look past this. Now, he's an easy politician to caricature. And so his critics, predictably, I think, characterize him as, this oaf or whatever who stumbled through the pandemic. And I think the truth is more nuanced than that. I think that if you're going to look at all of the different numbers and all of the evidence, Ontario locked down businesses longer than most other places did. We had a mask mandate long before British Columbia, the great lotus land that's governed by the New Democrats. They didn't have mask mandates before we did. They opened their schools earlier than we did. We kept our schools closed, and rightly or wrongly, I don't know. But all I know is that the fourth wave was a lot better here than the third wave. The third wave here for sure was bad, and it was because Ford took some very stupid advice from some people who he later dismissed from his cabinet or from his inner circle. So I think if you look at the broader swath of what's happened, I understand why the Tories want to move past the pandemic and look to the future. That's what all governments want to do. I mean, really, in the recent federal election, how much did we talk about the pandemic? We talked about the stupidity of the Tories, federal Tories, for not getting vaccinated, not making their MPs get vaccinated, their candidates vaccinated. I mean, Justin Trudeau won that election not because he was talking about the pandemic response, I think. If Ford gets reelected on June 2nd, it won't be because of the pandemic, but I don't think he also loses the election because of the pandemic either. I think that the conversation is going to change and evolve. And who knows? I mean, right now there's an uptick. So, is the sky falling? I mean, I look at the papers and you say, oh my gosh, here we go again. But I don't know. I think that things are going to evolve in a different way than maybe we've thought they would. I think it just feels like I went for a walk this morning, Raju, and it really feels like people are living with the pandemic, are living with COVID, and are figuring a way through it. That's why we have our vax passport. That's why we wear our masks. And that's why we wash our hands and keep our safe and social distance.
The best and worst things about a populist is that they care what people think.
Yeah. No, exactly. He really does. He wants to be loved.
Who doesn't? Listen, Rob, this has been great for us. Is there anything I didn't ask that you think our listeners should know?
No, I just think keep reading the Star, because we're going to stay on top of the Bradford Bypass and the 413 stories because they're important to our region and they're important to this province. And I think that it's critical that we keep on top of what's happening this is a fast growing region. There are going to be 1 million more people here in 5 years. And that's awesome because that's what makes this such an exciting and dynamic place. But we're going to have to build infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, whether it's roads or highways, subways, LRTs, things like that. So we have to figure out a way to do that in as responsible a way as we can.
Rob, fantastic for us. Really want to thank you for your time today, as always, sir.
Thanks, Raju. Always a pleasure, man.
Robert Benzie is the Queen's Park Bureau Chief for the Star. That's it for today. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm your host, Raju Mudler. Our This Matters team is Adrian Chung, Brian Bradley, JP Fozo, Matt Hearn, Morgan Bachneck, Saba Etizaz, and Sean Pattenden. Our music is by So-Called, Mike DeAngelis, and Sean Pattenden. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com/subscribingmatters. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.